You've probably heard that it's best to paint from dark to light, but what does it really mean? Starting with the shadows is never mandatory, but it helps in multiple ways. And in this episode, we'll study from one of the greatest masters of all time, Bouguereau, and I'll share with you this secret of the old masters that they used to create those wonderful paintings full of realism. Number one reason why it's smart to start with the shadows is keying. Setting your value key means establishing the range of darks and lights in the painting. When you begin with the darkest dark, i.e. the key, you immediately define the darkest element of that value scale. And what you're going to be trying to do is make sure that what you have on your model is the same value as what you paint on your painting. Keying consists in choosing a reference cutter here called a key cutter on the model and on the palette and admitting that they are the same. And why do we choose the darkest dark of the model for that? Simply because it's much easier to do so. And once the key has been established, all the remaining values in the painting are found by comparison from one to the other. Rather than trying to find an isolated cutter, we make sure that the difference between the key and the neighboring cutter is the same on the model and on the subject. And from there, we proceed by comparing the cutters one by one every time. Let me show you. So in this copy of Iris by Bouguereau, and by the way, if you want to practice with us, you can download the resource. You'll find the link in the description. So you can do that and practice with us. So here we are starting with the darks. Now I left this area here untouched just so that I can explain to you the process of keying. So here the key is stating that this black here on my model is the same as this one here. But here, as you can see, my dark in this area goes a lot darker than what my printer is capable of achieving. So I don't know if the camera gives this justice, but in this case, my key is slightly darker on my painting than it is on my model. But it's fine, it's all right, because I'm not trying to mix exactly the same as an absolute. I'm doing this as a relation. Now, what matters is not technically the key, it's the relation between the key and the cutter next to it right there. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to achieve the same difference on my painting as is visible on the model. I'm not looking exactly for this cutter. I'm looking for the same ratio between the key and the neighboring cutter. So this stripe cutter, I'm stepping back, squinting a little, and I see that I'm reaching something approaching. Now, this little stripe of value here, it goes slightly lighter there, but it's very soft, so I'm going to try to make it very gradual. So I think it's still a little darker, so I'm going to go darker, and everything I do is comparing my darkest, so my key, to the colors surrounding, and I go from one to the next every time. So here, for example, here I actually have a little bit more reflected lights, and it's also a little bit warmer, so I'm going to grab a little bit of my red. And I'm continuously adjusting based on comparing colors that are next to each other. So now, because the neck is sort of has a cylindrical volume, this area here is also slightly lighter, but not by much. It's very, very soft. Trying to also work on the edge. Not just the value, it's also the quality of the edge. And this is how I proceed, by constantly comparing areas that are next to each other. So now, in terms of strategy, what you want is you want to find an area to start with that has both the darkest value of your entire painting and also, not far from there, the lightest area. This way you can sort of build a bridge that connects the darkest dark to the lightest light. And very often this happens around the eye. So the pro tip of the day is that we don't necessarily always start with the eye just because it's fun and attractive, but also because very often in the eye you have both the lightest tones and the darkest very close. You don't need that much for keying. See, I just applied a very slim area of my darkest dark right there, and this is all I need. I can finish the hair later. I don't have to do all the darks. It's just the darks that connect to some of the most crucial lights that I'm trying to apply. Now, this is how Bouguereau used to paint. It's a timeless technique, and it's still very efficient today, and it's one of the best tricks for realism. A lot of the artists just don't necessarily understand what's at stakes behind the concept, the notion of starting with the darkest. So now you know. Reason number one is keying. Painting without first establishing the darkest dark is like trying to play a song without knowing the right key, the key the song is played in. Everything will kind of feel inconsistent and you'll always hit the wrong chords. It will all feel out of tune, and it's kind of the same thing. We start with the darkest dark because it's our way for us painters to sort of tune the values of our paintings. The second reason why we normally start from dark to light is because of the structural impact of the shadow shapes. Shadow shapes are not just tonal areas, they are an integral part of the structure of the work. They help as much with proportions and likeness, if not more, as they do with values. And what I mean by shadow shape is all this area that's sort of outlined by the edge of the shadow. It's not just descriptive of the value, it's also descriptive of the form. So if you start with the darkest, you focus on the quality and the shape of the shadow shapes. When you block in the full shadow mass early on, you establish the proportions and the big relationships right away. It reinforces the form of the subject and separates lights from shadow in a clean graphic way, which is something I always recommend before you start. The shadow shapes basically carve the form for you. They give you the big puzzle pieces before you worry about the smaller ones. And this is another reason why we start with the darks, is because the shadow mass functions like a blueprint. If the shadow is correct, then the underlying form is almost guaranteed to read correctly later on. If I don't define my shadow shapes properly, it's almost sure that the values will read wrong, and then the form will also look not convincing and not realistic. Reason number three, we want to add variety on top of the dark tones. A common misconception is that basically the shadow is just one big flat mass of brown, but it's not. There's a lot of variety in the shadow, and usually this is where it works the best to bring the variety, the warmth, the reflected lights, the temperature shifts, the chromatic accents, the violets, the reds, the green, depending on the situation, the soft gradations that reveal the turning of the form. There is a lot to do to fine-tune the shadows to make them not just a big dark mass of brown, but something much more subtle and much more realistic. If you don't start with the shadows first, it's very hard to keep the tone consistency under control, and very often you end up with, I don't know, reflected lights that are way too light compared to the midtones, or you'll have something inconsistent and unconvincing. So the rule is you want to bring as much variety and depth in your shadows as you can, but they can never be something that will compete with what happens on the light side of the subject. So you start with the shadows, you sort of establish the shadows, the vanilla version of your shadows, the normal version, untouched version. You then do the light tones, the mid tones, and when everything is established, what you can do is you can add variety. For example, here, if I add variety under the chin with a touch of red to bring those warm reflected lights, I'm going to do that next. So it's another reason why we start with the darks, so that we can bring more variety and that we can bring the complexity up progressively. We start with a relatively neutral base, so relatively flat shadows, and progressively we increase the complexity by reinforcing those accents, bringing more chromatic depth, extending the range of the shadows. And the final reason why we want to work from dark to light is not necessarily too much that we care about the dark, but that actually finishing with the light is also a very good painting strategy. Leaving the highlights for the final stage of the painting gives us many advantages. The number one advantage is that we get cleaner colors. So if you add the lights too early, they might mix with the wet darks and turn muddy. Basically, if you have something very light and you add the darks over it, it will immediately just neutralize it and make the darks very muddy and the lights very polluted. By waiting until the darks are applied before we can bring the highlights, we can place thick, opaque strokes that really stay pure. It sits on top without pollution or contamination from the darkest. We can use impasto or texture to enhance the impression of opacity. This is what painters refer to as saving our whites. It's not just for the value, it's also for practical reasons. If you incorporate the whites too early, the lights too early, you run the risk of having them polluted by the darks. If you keep them for the end, it makes everything cleaner and more efficient. Also note that they will have a stronger impact when the highlights are the last layer, the cherry on top. They naturally become fresher, more full of texture, more opaque and more intentional. Ending with the highlights isn't just a technique, it makes the finale of the painting clear, confident and crisp. Painting shadows first is one of the simplest ways to achieve clarity in your work. You establish the value key, you structure the form early on, you enrich the shadows with controlled reflected lights and variety, and you protect the purity of the highlights. It's an old method, it's a time-tested method, but it remains one of the most reliable approaches to achieving convincing lights, shadows, and overall realism. If you want to watch another great video, click here. I'll see you for the next one, my friends, and as always, joy and inspiration to you.